Death ends a life, not a relationship. Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Maury. I am going to die. So are you. We all are. But our relationships, the things that we leave for others, will live on. And part of that is creating a great estate plan. And that, my friend, is what we're going to talk about today and this entire month on the Retirement Answer Man Show. Welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. And this is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but to truly rock retirement. Rock your life, your one life. So this entire month, we're going to be exploring estate planning in retirement. And today we're going to talk about the basics, but we're going to get into more than just simply the documents that you need throughout this month, because a properly done estate plan, which is much more than documents, is a way of continuing a relationship and loving on those that are left behind in ways that you may not even imagine. So we're going to explore that this month. And today we'll talk about the basics. But first, let's have a word from our sponsor. I was in a private office hours with a member of the Rock Retirement Club. That's our online community where we have over 350 people walking life together, learning and helping each other make this transition into retirement. And they said that their number one issue is changing their mindset about what they can do with their future. They felt like they'd been too institutionalized into working and saving and investing, working and saving and investing. And now they're entering retirement and they want to make sure that they don't just continue with the same mindset because it's a very different phase of life. And they wanted to make sure that they could change that mindset so they could live fully in retirement. They want to know how to embrace life in retirement. This is a very common theme that I hear from club members. And we explore this in our weekly meetups, in our workshops. So the Rock Retirement Club, and you can find out more at rockretirementclub.com, is a safe place for thoughtful people that listen to the show to have these discussions and receive world-class education on how to do retirement right. Of course, we go into the financial side in our master classes, but we also go into helping each other make these transitions on the non-financial side. And it's a safe place to have these conversations that's free from all the craziness of the internet, where you can receive coaching and encouragement. So if you think this might be right for you, we would love to have you join us. You can go to rockretirementclub.com.
Huh? What does that mean?
Estate planning. It's one of those things that everybody knows they should have, or they've heard they should have, but very few have, and very few really understand what it is. So estate planning is essentially just the process of anticipating and arranging while you're alive the management and disposal of your financial and legal life. That's the dry estate planning that if you don't have one, the government has one for you, and it may not reflect the wishes that you have. So even if you've never done an estate plan, there is one sitting there for you in the courts of the United States that will determine how your legal and finances will be distributed when you pass. So that's the dry, blah, boring part of it. But estate planning done correctly can be an important gift that you give to people. So we're going to go over today in our main segment, the basic documents, all that blah stuff, but we'll talk a little bit about why they're important, so we can get that basics down. And then throughout the month, we'll start to explore how to make it something that's really special that can be a big gift to the people that you leave that you care about. There is a gentleman I met in person for the first time a little over a year ago, member of the Rock Retirement Club. But we had interacted for a number of years via email because he was a listener to the show. And he was one of the initial members of the Rock Retirement Club almost 2 years ago. And he was very enthusiastic. He was in his early 60s. He was just winding down, getting to retirement within a year or two, had done everything himself for years. And he was just excited about all the travel that he and his wife of 25 plus years were going to go on. He was excited about spending time with his adult children that all lived in the same neighborhood, in the same area. And he was a great encourager to others in the club, but to me and to my children who he got to meet when we had our rodeo roundup, our first conference with the club. And then right after that meeting, he realized that he had or diagnosed with a terminal illness and was given 2 to 5 years. But the 2 to 5 years weren't going to be awesome at the end. And this brought front and center for him, because he was right at the edge of retiring, that he needed to deal with this. He needed to front load experiences with his children. They did extensive travel. And although he was fairly frugal throughout his life, he spent money on travel and making sure experiences were happening over the last year or so that were planned out over a very long period of time. He was amazed at the money that he was spending, but this urgency that got put in front of him made him very comfortable with it. And that's good. Luckily, a lot of this travel was able to happen prior to COVID. You can imagine if it was a year later when it wouldn't be available to him and his family. Well, this 2 to 5 year lifespan that he had actually was about a year. He passed away recently, very suddenly. And that's what we all face at times. While he was doing all of this planning in terms of creating these experiences, don't get me wrong, he was very involved with all of his family and his friends all throughout his life. He was just one of those kind of people. So it wasn't making up for things he didn't do. It was just accelerating it. But along with that, he spent a year, because we had a lot of private office hours and I ended up helping him more formally in preparing for when he couldn't have the reins. Because in this relationship, he managed the financial end of it. And it's not always the case. Many times it's the lady. But he organized his estate plan. But he went well beyond organizing simply the estate plan. We went through organizing the personal end of it, of making sure relationships were in place, making sure things were tidied up. And thank God he did, because he passed before he should have. And it was an amazing gift to his wife, to his children, and we're currently going through the estate planning closure for him. And absent all the work that he did, not just on the paperwork stuff, but on the communication and the relationship stuff, it would have been a bloody mess. And I've gone throughout my career, many bloody messes of things that weren't tidied up, where a grieving spouse was searching the house, trying to figure out how to open the safe where the documents might have been, having assets all over the place and having to go call and the 1-800 number and sit on hold and get documents and go back to the court to get another document that you forgot to get or you didn't know you were supposed to get, and going back and forth. And think of the surviving spouse. If he's already grieving his wife and having to deal with all this legal weird stuff and getting all the pushback and being put on hold and everything else, it makes a bad situation a lot worse. Or even I've seen situations where I've seen it. Situations where they couldn't even access the money and they had a liquidity crunch. They didn't have money to go continue to pay bills because they didn't know how to get to the money, because the bank wouldn't give them the money until all the information and paperwork was processed. So we can talk about estate plans and we'll talk about the basic documents today, but the documents are just a vehicle to get the purpose, the objective done, which is to literally bless your family with simplicity, elegant simplicity, which is always the goal of this show in retirement and rocking life, is elegant simplicity, so they can not have that added stress of a messy life to clean up from a legal and financial sense. So say a prayer for his family. They're wonderful people. He passed away recently. We miss him. So what are the basics of estate planning? So estate planning is essentially your personal and legal wishes for your life and your stuff. And the purpose of an estate plan is to close out this official life, this financial life, and it also is a gift to the family. So let's talk about the basics. And then going forward, if you have questions, please go to rogerwhitney.com and you can ask me a question there and we'll try to answer those. And in an upcoming 6-Shot Saturday, which is our weekly email, we'll have a checklist of things you should consider when updating an estate plan. And you only get that if you are on our 6-Shot Saturday list. And it's a quick email that's a summary of the show. So you can go to rogerwhitney.com and get access to that. So let's talk about the basics of estate planning. So when you pass away, there is a process that the state has, whichever state you live in, called probate. And this is the legal process of closing out your financial and legal life. And the most important document to execute within the probate process, because your assets will go through probate, this legal process to distribute your assets, is a will, last will, and testament. Now, most people don't have a will, but they actually do, because if you don't put into written form via a will and last will and testament your wishes, the court in whichever state you live in will have a process for distributing your assets. So the idea of creating a last will and testament is, I would rather choose where my assets go than have the U.S. legal system choose where my assets go. So that's what a last will and testament will do. So it's going to have a couple components. A last will and testament is going to have an executor. An executor is the person that you appoint to be your representative to the court through this probate process to execute the terms of the will. So that's their only job. Sounds sort of simple, but an executor actually can be a very difficult job, because they're the ones that are going to have to manage the paperwork and go to all the financial institutions and to the lending company and to get your deed changed to close out and distribute your assets based on your wishes, which means they're the ones that are going to have to gather the paperwork from the court, go to each individual financial institution, fill out their paperwork, give them the paperwork they ask for, which usually happens after they call an 800 number, they wait on hold, and then they wait on hold, and then they wait on hold, and get disconnected and call back. It's a big job. It can be a big job. So this is choosing your executive. You want to be respectful with that. You can choose to compensate your executor. Typically, it's the spouse. If you're married, so if you're married, and like if I were to pass, Shauna is my executor of my last will and testament. Well, as you can imagine, she would be very, very distraught if I passed away. Maybe couldn't even get out of bed. And then she has to go do this paperwork shuffle. So tidying all this up as best you can is probably a good idea and a good gift, in my case, to Shauna. And if you're not married, typically it's a family member or a good friend that you've known for years. So you're giving them a little bit of a burden. And there are more and more professional executors, basically trust type companies, that will do this from an institutional standpoint that you pay for, that will take that burden off. But it's something to consider. And this is one thing in a will. Let's say you're single and your best friend, Sally from college, who you're still best buds with, you agree to be each other's executor. Well, then 5 years goes on and you don't talk to Sally so much, or you had a falling out and now you pass away, Sally's the executor. That's one reason why we want to revisit these. So the will helps you is your legal document to take to the probate process. And it's basically in the will, you're going to determine these are all my assets and this is how I want them, or who I want them to go to. So that's the first basic document. Second basic document in a basic estate plan is a power of attorney. This is Roger is in a coma for 6 months. Well, Roger still has bills to pay. Roger still has, all my stuff to do. A power of attorney is my document. If I'm in a coma for 6 months and I have an account in my name only, the power of attorney in this case is naming Shauna, my wife. She can take that document to the institution and say, hey, I got power to do this stuff. Give me access to the account information. I have power to transact and so forth. So that's what a durable power of attorney allows you to do. Now, side note, I am not an attorney. I am not an estate planner. I dealt with it from the financial planning end. Talk to estate planners. I'm just sharing my expertise on this, but I am not a professional in the estate planning area. I've just dealt with it. You can also do things which are springing powers of attorney, meaning there's a document that while I'm fine, somebody can't take and use, but if I happen to be in a coma in this example, it will spring into action and then I will have the ability to go and transact, or that person will. So that's what powers of attorney on. So we want to have those in place. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to make your financial life move on in the event that you're not able to, even if it's just for a week or two. The next basic thing that you need to do in an estate planning exercise is designate beneficiaries. So we talked about this probate process, which is the legal court process to close out your financial life, which can be time consuming, sometimes costly, depending on what state you live in, because each state has their own probate process and costs and rules. Well, there are things that go outside of the probate process, and that has to do with beneficiaries and titling of accounts. So as an example, a 401k, an IRA, a Roth IRA, a 403b, accounts like that are beneficiary driven, meaning that when you establish, say, an IRA, you designate who your beneficiary is or beneficiaries. And you can say, okay, for me, I'm Roger Whitney. If I pass, 100% of this account goes to my wife, Shauna. I could also say it's divided 30% between these people. So when you establish a IRA or Roth, you can name who the beneficiary is. And when you do that, what happens is when you pass, that asset, let's say this IRA account, will bypass all of the courts and be able to be moved directly to that person as a beneficiary IRA in this example. So that's important because that makes it very quick. You just need to have the basic paperwork. The beneficiary sets up an account and the money is transferred over. And more accounts are being driven in a beneficiary way. Obviously, all the retirement accounts, but now in state by state, they have what's called a transfer on death account. So as an example, if I had a bank account in Roger Whitney's name, I could make that a transfer on death account, which would say, rather than just have it be in my name and have to go through the probate process, I can say, when I die, here is the beneficiary for this checking account. And again, it just eases the distribution of your assets. And the more that you can get out of going through probate, the quicker and more efficient things will be. And that also goes to titling accounts. If you're married, there's different types of titling of tenants in common, which means you have joint but separate interests in the account, or joint tenants with rights of survivorship, which means if one party passes, all the assets automatically goes to the other account. So you can imagine if you have beneficiaries on all of these type of accounts, life changes. Again, divorces happen, and I've seen where an ex-spouse was named as the beneficiary of an IRA, and it was never cleaned up when the divorce happened, and they were legally entitled to those assets. So once we set these beneficiaries, we're going to have a rhythm of doing a sprint to review them, which just has to be part of that agile process. One final note on beneficiaries is contingent beneficiaries. This is something that can be important in very rare situations. So again, a case example. I have an IRA. My wife is the primary beneficiary, 100%. Well, if my wife and I pass together, a contingent beneficiary is, okay, who gets the assets if the primary and the owner are gone? It's going to go look to contingent beneficiaries. So in this case, it would be, say, my two children. So you have that contingent, just like you would have a backup executor if the executor you named could not act on your behalf. So it's important, or it's a good practice to have contingent beneficiaries in the event that the primary is not there. If you don't have a contingent beneficiary, that's okay. The U.S. court system has one for you. That asset will go to your estate and be handled through probate, and there actually could be a little bit more problematic tax-wise because there's no beneficiary IRA that's going to be had from there. But so we want to make sure we have those beneficiaries dialed in. Another important document is the healthcare power of attorney. So we had the durable power of attorney, which allowed someone to act on your behalf for your financial assets and legally. What a healthcare power of attorney does is it allows you to appoint someone to make healthcare decisions for you if you're not able to make them. It could be that you're in a coma. It could be that you're ruled that you're not of sound mind to make decisions for yourself. So a healthcare power of attorney says, I'll use myself as an example. Roger's in a coma. My wife is appointed to make my healthcare decisions in working with the doctors. And that can be important because absent one, that could delay treatment and create friction in dealing with whatever issues there are. And in this healthcare power of attorney, you're also able to specify your wishes when it comes to sustaining life in certain situations, when you may not want to have life-saving actions taken during specific situations. So you want your wishes to be followed. So you want to outline them in that healthcare power of attorney, and you want to appoint someone that can execute and you trust to make decisions on your behalf when you're not able to. Now, the next one is really a letter of intent, the next document. This is not a formal legal document, but this is a document that just gives your wishes on specific items. I want to make sure Johnny has this journal from my grandfather, and I want to make sure that Sally has this journal from your uncle. This is more of a personal letter to your family, designating specific things of more sentimental value that you want to give to someone. And in a later episode, we're going to talk about a document of who do I call first and having that action plan to make it simpler. But a letter of intent is a non-legal document that just relays your wishes in a more personal way. So that is the basics of estate planning. We'll get into things like a living trust in a future episodes. But next week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about giving to family. What are ways that you can give to family while you're alive, but also after you pass in an efficient way to be comfortable in how you're giving, and also to make sure that you maximize or try to optimize your tax situation. But for now, let's go talk to Tanya and answer some of your listener questions. So here we are. We're going to answer some of your listener questions. And because Nicole has abandoned me to raise her new human for a few months, I don't like being all alone. So we have an awesome financial planner out of Duluth, Minnesota, which is actually a cool town. We have Tanya Nichols from Align Financial. How you doing, Tanya?
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
I love, is it Fitgers? What's the place there?
Fitgers.
Fitgers,
It's
yeah.
a brew house locally on Lake Superior.
Yeah, it's awesome. You have the growlers. Everybody know what a growler is. You can actually take your big jug and go fill it up with their beer. I've done that before there, actually.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So how are things in Duluth?
81 degrees, which in Duluth is absolutely gorgeous.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Enjoy that one day of the year.
Basically, yes.
So I have a question for you, because you're a financial planner, and I know that you're a pretty prudent person from a planning perspective, but I also know that you have a new love of four-wheeling, which is not so prudent per se. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, last year I made a commitment to bringing more joy into my life. And so I've actually been working really hard to do as many things that make me laugh as possible. And riding in a side-by-side with a seatbelt and a roll cage on these trails in the woods in northern Minnesota is, on a scale of 1 to 10 for four-wheeling, probably about as prudent as you could be. And I laugh. I absolutely laugh, and it's a really great time. So that's how I reconcile it, is because I'm outweighing joy to, I guess, prudent safety precautions.
No, in your
and you get incredibly dirty, which is highly irregular for me as well. And I don't know why, but is so fun.
I think that's important. Joy. I like that. So that's sort of your theme, your word. Do you talk about this with your clients in your financial planning practice?
I do. Last year, I had a Post-it note on my computer, and it said, laugh with my kids. That was my big objective for 2019, and we're carrying it into 2020. And so I include pictures in my newsletters of the fun stuff my kids and I are doing, and they're riding on four-wheelers, and we're just doing really cool stuff. So yes, I absolutely bring that into my into my relationships with my clients.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this. In the Rock Retirement Club, we have a ladies only group that's sort of a subset where they can have discussions specific to them. And I'm the administrator of everything, so every now and then I can see things. And there was a healthy discussion of the advantages of, or potential no advantage of, a lady working with a lady planner. So I'd be interested in your perspective on that, being that you are a lady and a planner. Do you think there's some advantage to that? Or how does a lady navigate whether I should really work with a lady or not? Or do you have any opinion on that?
That is a great question. I do, I run an investment firm for women within a few years of retirement. And so I do specifically work mostly with women. But if I was a woman seeking out a planner, I think what I would be looking for is someone that can hear and see me. And if I find that person happens to be a man and I'm listening to his podcast or following him on social media or receiving his newsletter, emails, whatever, if I feel like we're speaking the same language, I don't know that it has to be men or women. I do think that women, when it comes to money, one of the things a lot of us and I'm sure some men too, but what I've noticed with my clients is a lot of women just don't feel good about their money. And they carry some maybe shame about their success and how they have been responsible and prudent about their careers and their savings and investment, even if they are the money decision maker in their family. I just think people should be able to feel good about their money. So that's what they should be looking for in their relationship with their planner, is someone that can hear them and see them and help them decide what's important to them. And maybe I might be biased thinking that I might be better able to do that because I've certainly wrestled with some of those same feelings in the past myself as an independent and successful female entrepreneur. But I think there's a lot of really amazing men out there that can do that same work and are doing it every day.
Yeah, I think I love that. Regardless of who it is, do you feel like you're seen and you're heard and they have a process that fits? They speak what, your same belief systems and values.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know how I think about that. I agree. I think that's what it is. Someone had asked me about my team or made a comment about my team because there's 5 of us. And except for me, they all happen to be women. And my wife pointed that out to me and it wasn't intentional. I'm like, I'm just looking for great people that have the same spirit and they just happen to all be women, which is fine. So I don't know. I agree. That's a good way to think about it. So,
and my employee, my office manager happens to be a man.
Yeah. Cooper, right?
Kind of Cooper.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. He's interacted with, he runs things. I already figured that out. Sort of like Nicole runs things.
And my life.
Sort of like Nicole runs my things. I have all these different names. Nicole, we never said all my name. I'm sure Cooper fits all of these. I call her my awesome sidekick. I call her the gutter bumpers of my life because he keeps me going down the lane. We all need to have good roles that complement each other.
Right.
So I got a couple questions here, Tanya. So this is Larry on withdrawals and inflation. I'll just read the question and I'm interested in your thoughts on it. And we can discuss it. He says, when planning for withdrawals and retirement, wouldn't it be reasonable to plan for level withdrawals? Investment returns increase the value while inflation eats away at the value. If inflation outstrips returns, and I'm not quite getting this part, there is the added protection of, I guess if your inflation outweighs your returns, then you can slow your spending through your slow go or no go years. And he says, I hear a lot about complicated factors, but a level withdrawal, sort of like an annuity approach, seems to incorporate all of them. And as a fellow Spartan, he likes the show. So do you think we make this too complicated when we're thinking about our spending patterns and we could just use an annuity way where it's $10,000 a month?
I think in practice, a lot of my clients do keep a level withdrawal throughout their retirement. They're looking at, let's say we set up a portfolio withdrawal every month on the 5th of the month goes to their bank account, even though we've built in inflation adjustments in the planning scenario. And I'm interested to hear what your clients are doing, but a lot of mine, they're not asking for a raise every year. I mean, in fact, that's kind of how they got to a place where they have enough money is because they've just gotten used to living on less than they make every month. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't take the adjustment. In fact, we talk about it, but I would agree with Larry that that's certainly one way of maintaining a somewhat conservative approach is not taking those adjustments. But I would position back, maybe one of the questions I might ask is, are you living the way you want to live? Do you feel good or do you feel restrained? And I think the outcome may be that you end up with more money at the end than you maybe intended. And is that okay with you? Like, is that a reasonable outcome? Or would you have felt better if you would have been able to take one more trip or do more socially or otherwise? So what do you think?
No, I agree with you in the sense my clients generally don't get their 3% raise every year. We don't spend that way. And you're right. I think we all have a little bit of adverse selection where we have clients that are best prepared to be able to retire. Generally, it's more helping them think bigger than it is pulling them back.
Agreed.
Like if you look at just a calculator, I have it right here in front of me, so I won't say I'm smart and I'm doing this in my head. If you think $10,000 a month, if you assume a 3% inflation rate, in the calculators, that means that $10,000 would only buy, we'll round it to $7,500 worth of stuff. So it loses a good amount of its value. And over 20 years, that $10,000 a month at 3% inflation would only have purchasing power of like $5,500 a month. And I think that's the reason why we try to include it in there, but we don't spend that way. What I have found is it's level, but then every now and then there's a step, right? And I think when we look at long-term care insurance, and this may be a bad example, is the shock factor of increases in premiums. There's a lot of reason to have shock factor. I paid for years, they've never increased, and all of a sudden it's 40%. But if you calculate it out over the period of time that it never went up, it's probably more reasonable from an inflation standpoint. So I have found people step up periodically, but not every year, which I think helps make it more conservative by factoring it in. Now, how do you plan? I was about to call you Nicole. You're not
I heard
Nicole.
that.
Nicole, you're not Nicole. You're Tanya. You're much nicer to me than Nicole is.
I haven't been here that long, though.
That's true. Yeah, the shine's worn. I told her I was like an old shoe to her now. But how do you plan for, I think a level spending assumption is still too simplistic, right? Because I'm sure your clients have extraordinary things, the lumpiness of spending. And so if you have a lumpiness of spending, say 6 years from now, they're going to buy an upgraded four-wheeler. Would you put an inflation rate on that?
Well, here's how I structure it. I like to make sure, and in the case of something like a new toy, like a boat or a four-wheeler or whatever, in something of that size, I like to structure it where they're getting enough money every month that they should be building up their own savings account, like almost like their own personal family line of credit. So just the way that when they're working and they're collecting their paychecks, if they've done it right, they're collecting more than they need every 2 weeks. And some of that is going into the later expense bucket. So for me, I wouldn't want them to take a raise to pay the payment on the side-by-side or the four-wheeler or the boat. I'd actually want them, I might have actually thought maybe I did this wrong. If I wasn't sending them enough money that they couldn't just write a check for $15,000, maybe we weren't doing this exactly right. So some of those bigger expenses or lumpy expenses that come up, I would hope that they might have, we've been planning right, at least maybe 6 months worth of money, maybe that's $50,000 or something like that, just kind of rolling around. Now, some advisors would argue that's crazy because you're not earning anything on that, but they're more likely to buy that toy, in my opinion, or take that trip or take all the family to Disney or do whatever the thing is if they have the money under their control. So I'm a big fan of making sure we're sending enough early and often so that when those things happen, it's managed through their cash flow rather than from their portfolio.
That is really interesting. I've not heard it done that way. So I'll explain the way we do it, but I want to come back to yours. So we forecast spending 1 to 2 years in advance on the big items. So like if it's right now or second half of 2020, the conversation we're having of, okay, we have it planned that you're looking at doing this big trip in 2021. Is that still relevant? Is it going to be higher? Yes, no. And then we start planning the cash flow on my side rather than having them save for it. So we plan it. But what I like about yours is the behavioral aspect of it. Because what I have found is one of the scary things for people is that they're used to saving. And there's some joy in saving. And this way you're giving them that joy of, I got my 10,000 and I'm putting this 1,000 over here in this account. So they get to feel like they're still saving.
Right.
It presumes that they're not going to flit it away. But
right. That's what I like about what I would say about your approach. And I do have that happening with plenty of clients as well, who aren't necessarily as skilled cash flow planners, that maybe they're the kind of people that always had 1 or 2 car payments and a mortgage and a home equity line. Those folks, the cash flow side of things, I might have to carve out a part of the portfolio and say that this is for the lumpy spending. I know you're going to buy a new snowmobile. You're not going to think you're going to buy a new snowmobile, but we've been together for 5 years. You are going to buy a new one. So I'm just
this is my forever snowmobile, right? This is my forever snowmobile.
Yeah. This is my last truck I'm purchasing, or whatever. So I might carve out a part of their portfolio and then reduce the portfolio withdrawal in the other part of the portfolio that is not for
So they're literally living
spending.
Paycheck to paycheck.
In some cases, I do have folks that are doing that. I mean, that's not ideal. And we really work hard to try to get them out of that pattern. But if you've had that pattern for 30 years and you just made a lot of money in your job, so it worked for you, or maybe you had big bonuses every year, like a lot of the physicians that I've worked with, sometimes that can be hard to shift out of. So we just need to plan behind the scenes on that.
I'm a big believer in, rather than correcting behavior, trying to modify systems to manage the behavior. And I think like if they're living paycheck to paycheck, if that's what they're used to, that's fine as long as you control what the paycheck is, right?
Right.
And I think that's really important because the whole goal of you and I, or even if you're doing it yourself, is to set the systems up to serve how you operate. Some people need to have their envelopes that they're saving into, and they're not happy if they don't do that. And other people are going to spend every dollar, so you better set up a system that does the enveloping for them. I like that. That's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And rather than standing in judgment as a financial advisor about, wow, you're doing this wrong because you're living paycheck to paycheck, it's just about acceptance and understanding and making it work, making the system work. But I do have some people who they want it to be different. And then after a few years of experimenting, we recognize, how do we just make this support what is likely going to continue to happen
I like it.
in a way that works for everyone.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to modify some things. So, all right, our next question is on, I've had this once or twice before. So it's done both ways. So anyway, I'll read it. My husband and I, this is from Laura. Hey, Laura. My husband and I have secure income from a pension and immediate annuities to cover our portion of expenses. And we take portfolio withdrawals to cover the rest of the expenses. How do I factor the secure income into our overall portfolio asset allocation? Do I take the present value of them and put them on the balance sheet and think of them maybe as a fixed income allocation, or do I think of them differently? So do you have a way that you deal with how you account for a pension or a immediate annuity?
Okay. So Laura, thank you for this question. I think it forced me to think about this in a different way, because I wouldn't say I put this on there as a balance sheet item. To me, it's just an income, because essentially I can't do anything else to it. I can't sell it or get anything else other than this monthly income stream. So a few questions came to mind for me, and all of these would depend on, are those income payments guaranteed for your whole life? If they are, then I might look at some of these questions differently. But I would actually look at the portfolio withdrawals that you're doing to meet your excess expenses. I would actually look at that as a whole separate decision, in my opinion. And I would look at it as, how big is the portfolio? What percentage are you taking out? And how long do you need that money to pay you? Like, if you don't have survivor benefits on that pension, for example, and if your spouse dies and you don't receive any of that, or you only receive 50%, will your portfolio withdrawals have to go up in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years? So how you treat the portfolio, how much money you need from it, what percentage, that would actually dictate the asset allocation, in my opinion. Kind of like, what job does that money need to do for you? And the income side, the immediate annuities and the pensions, we know what job that money is doing. We just need to understand how long and for who and how much does that last. And then how does that affect how much you take out of the other portfolio? And then that's a separate decision about allocation in that regard.
Yeah, because I've heard that.
There's my 2 cents.
Oh, that was at least a quarter. I've heard that some people think of, an annuity payment can replace the bond portion of your portfolio. And actually, the coach in the Rock Retirement Club, BW, has a little bit more of that view, but I'm not going to speak for him. So Laura, this is how I think of it. So if you think about, to extend your logic, would you put Social Security as a present value on your balance sheet or on your net worth statement, right? Same type of thing. In fact, it's inflation adjusted. And I think there's a value to doing it both ways. So here's how I think of it. If you need $100,000 a year, you have 3 sources to pay for that $100,000 a year. You have what's called social capital, which is pensions, immediate annuities, Social Security, and that's a cash flow asset. Like you said, Tanya, you can't do anything with it other than use the money. So that's going to cover, let's say, 60,000 of the 100,000 that you need. The next source of capital after social capital is going to be what's called human capital, which is our superpower, actually. And that's the one that we traditionally give up in retirement, our work, our ability to earn an income. But let's say you have a part-time job for 10 years that you earn at 10 grand a year. Okay, now that's going to cover another 10,000. So now we need 30,000 a year from our portfolio, your financial capital. So I don't put it on the balance sheet because it's really cash flow that's going to be used. And then when you're determining in your financial portfolio, and this sort of says what you said, Tanya, I think, is, well, if I need $30,000 a year for my portfolio, then you create, whether it's your bucket system, in my case, I call it a pie cake because I like that. It sounds yummy. You build out a bucket system or sequence to time segment your money to make sure you hit that 30,000 and whatever's happening forward. So on the balance sheet, I would say, no, Laura, you don't, unless you go all the way. And so in the course in the Rock Retirement Club, what we do is we build what's called a household balance sheet, which is different than a balance sheet. In a household balance sheet, we actually create the net present value of your social capital, your pensions, your Social Security, etc., the net present value of your human capital, any part-time work, and then you have your financial capital, which is today's dollars. And then on the other side, you have your debts, but we also put the net present value of your consumption. So now we've brought everything back down to today. And then it allows you to better compare apples to apples without worrying about market returns or anything else. And so then you can start to factor ratios of how overfunded or constrained or underfunded you are relative to the consumption that you want to make. And that gives you a better position to figure out what strategies are best. So that's, I think, what we're talking about is the difference between a balance sheet and a household balance sheet. So I wouldn't put it as a net present value unless you're doing everything, because otherwise it's not really going to give you, I think, the data that you need.
Can you tell me more about how you come up with the net present value of the future spending? Like, do you just you extrapolate how much you're going to spend in 30 years?
So you map out, well, so if you think of the retirement planning, what you're really doing is building a long-term cash flow model. You know, if you're 60 and you're going to die at 90, you're going to, the way we do it anyway, is if you're 60 and you're going to die at 90, we don't make everybody die at 90. They can live longer. But each year is a debt that they owe themselves, right? If they need $100,000 in year one, that they're going to have $100,000 there to get it. So we map out how much they need each year with some of the extraordinaries. And that gives us our timeline from a cash flow perspective. And then we map out the cash flow on the other side of the ledger. What income sources do we have coming in? And we do tax estimates and everything else. And then what we get is what the deficit is each year in theory. And that's the amount that's going to have to come from your financial capital.
Okay. That's interesting.
It doesn't get you all the way, but what we try to do is neutralize trying to do market returns.
Okay.
Because when you just do normal financial planning, if you're doing it on a spreadsheet, you're going to put in fact, this will get to the next question, which is perfect. It wasn't even planned this way, where you're going to have to put in, I'm going to earn 7% or I'm going to earn 8%. And so when you're forecasting forward, the chance for really bad results is bigger than if you bring it all back down. So what we'll do is on spending and on human capital and such, we'll use a discount rate to bring it all back down to present value. Now we sort of neutralized performance as far as markets. And then based on how funded you are, if you're overfunded, well, then maybe a safe withdrawal rate is a better strategy because you have lots of cushion. And depending on how constrained you are, you don't have room to worry about, deal with markets. So maybe you're a little bit safer. And if you're underfunded, maybe you're working or using more secure things. The hard part with underfunded, right, is you need returns, but you can't afford to take the risk to get returns.
Right.
So hopefully, Laura, this wasn't more complicated than you expected, but in the masterclass series, we walk through building this entire cash flow model so you can understand your ratios to start to choose strategies that work.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I brought up the percentage you need from the portfolio, Laura, and whether or not those expenses can be turned up or down. So if you need this money in order to pay your bills and it's not like discretionary spending, then that actually might dictate your portfolio allocation more than whether or not your other income is how much guaranteed income you have on the other side. It's really more what you're doing to that one account that drives that allocation, in my opinion.
I think that's a really excellent point, right? Because when you're calculating your ratios, like if you have 80% or even 70% of your needs, and I define needs as a good life, not not all the fancy stuff, but you can still travel and such. If you have 80% of your needs covered by secure income sources, you have a lot more flexibility with that's the most important ratio. And then the add-ons of the tricked out four-wheeler or whatever is, all discretionary. So you don't want to just put it all in one lump sum. When you're planning, do you focus on needs and then add on discretionary, or do you see people just lumping it all together? Because there's an important distinction.
Where we start is what they're doing now. I really just look at how have you been living for the last few years? And I find for a lot of people, there are some that are real clear about their goals, which I think is why your book and some of the conversations you're having in your groups are so important, because a lot of my clients just have a hard time even imagining what might be different. So when we're getting started, really, we're just looking at what has happened and then anything they know for sure. But if they've been spending $10,000 a month, I might try to just shoot for the $10,000 a month, and I might add an extra 20 grand a year of just question mark. Just whatever, just to start to give them the idea of what this could look like based on their current lifestyle. But I certainly had lots of colleagues do the needs versus wants. I find most people that I'm working with, they're with me because they maybe haven't paid as much attention to some of those differences as they wish they would have. And so narrowing those is really hard for some people.
I think it's sort of, when you think about these aspirational things, that's a good point. I see the same thing. I see some people that just they have great imaginations. And other people, not that they don't have imagination, but they're just such good accumulators, and they have that Protestant work ethic. Franciscan don't need much to be happy, which is beautiful, which is true, that they don't lack imagination, but it's hard to think of on a blank piece of paper what could be. So they don't die with too much money, that big risk on the other side, right?
Right.
Okay, our last question sort of dives into all this. It's really not a question. And Tanya was excited to really comment on this one. Right? It's math. So we have a friend of the show, Al, and Al has emailed over the years, and remember a month or so ago, we had the whole month on retirement assumptions, and he wanted to talk about using averages, because we use a lot of assumptions in retirement planning, one of them being average return, right? And he's a mathematician. He's not a statistician, but he teaches statistics, or has taught. And he hears the word average all the time, not just on the show, my show, but everywhere, right? Average return of the S&P 500 over the last 80 years. We've all heard that if you read financial stuff. And he wanted to point out that you have a choice of reporting average, which is the mean, which is adding up all the returns over the years and just dividing by the number of years, which is what people use, to median, which is when you have wide swings around an average. From my understanding is median is better. So what median is, it just takes all of the numbers and it slips right down into the middle of it. So let me give you an example here. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So Al gives an example. He says, let's say if you wanted to know the price of a home in Duluth, the median or middle price is more accurate to represent the center of all values than the averages, because an average, you could have a couple really, really, really expensive houses that would skew the average. Or on the flip side, really, really, really bad returns, right? So if we looked at, say, the returns on the S&P 500 from 1998 to 2008, right after 2008, everybody's talking about the average annual return was 0 for the last 10 years, but the median wasn't. And that's an important distinction. So I asked Al, Tanya, well, why does everybody use average? Because we know, and I've showed the chart before, in the S&P 500, if it averages 10% a year, if you go back to 1926 or so, only 6 times in that time period was it within 2% of 10%. It was never close to the average. So why do we use it? Al's thought was momentum. It's something easy to talk about. And it's just probably easier, I hate to say this, easier to manipulate in terms of when you pick your end date and back date. I don't know the answer. And I sort of think, Tanya, it relates to Laura's. If you can plan by backing out the need to even make that assumption, that might be helpful because it's so unknowable. How do you find your capital market assumptions, your return assumption? How do you settle on that?
Well, after many years of using all this, the financial planning software, I think the longer I do this, the less I rely on some of those assumptions. So when I read Al's question, my very first thought was, excellent point, Al. And that was about all I could come up with. But one of the things that I was thinking about as you were sharing about the S&P numbers, have you ever heard that Peter Lynch story? I'm thinking I've got his name right. He was the longtime manager of the Magellan Fund, the Fidelity Magellan Fund. And I think there was some research done on the actual investor experience that owned that fund versus the average return, or, the composite return of that fund over a period of time. And it was like 2.9%. I'm sure you've seen these somewhere, these types of studies. So the average return was like, let's say it's 10%. I don't remember what it was, but let's say it's 10% or some number like that. Over a 20-year period was 10%. But the actual person who owned it only earned 2.9% purely based on the timing of investment and withdrawals and contributions. And so this conversation about median versus mean, or median versus average, makes me think of that so much of this has to do more with our behavior, unless our human lives are just not necessarily average. We all have these peaks and valleys, and our behavior is going to impact these numbers to a much greater degree than we expect. And so that's why spending more time talking about cash flow and how much you need and how your life's, what's important to you, I think has a bigger impact on your net worth and the way you feel than which average or median or mean we actually use.
Yeah. And I think your comment to me when we looked at it was before the show, was like, great point. But okay, what do I do with it? Right.
Yeah.
And you have great timing because we just ended the month series on behavioral finance. And I think it was Dr. Daniel Crosby pointed out, and he joined us in the club. If we think of investment theory, we have specific risk, which is buying a stock or whatever, and all the risk that goes around with that. And then you can diversify almost every risk, and then you're left with market risk. That's the financial way of thinking about risk management and retirement plan, any kind of planning financially. And I believe it was him that brought up the point. But there's another risk. It's the behavioral risk, not just with your investments, but with all sorts of decisions that needs management as well. And I personally think that's the biggest lever and the biggest area of value that a real financial advisor, someone like you and hopefully like me, can do. So excellent point.
Totally agreed.
Excellent point. We're so human. I have to remind Roger, stop beating yourself up. You're just human. So frustrating sometimes. Tanya, this was
beautiful and tragic.
Exactly. That is how I describe myself. Beautifully tragic. So how can people get a hold of you and connect with you?
Check us out at align.financial, and we stay connected with clients and colleagues and our communities through a monthly newsletter where we share interesting info, and you can see pictures of me on my side-by-side with my kids.
Oh, is it on there? I'll have to look for it.
Well,
Awesome.
It's not on there, but on the newsletter.
Oh, okay.
That's on the next month. There'll be pictures of me exploring the woods in northern Minnesota.
Beautiful. Thanks, Tanya. You have a wonderful day, Tanya. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Bye, Roger.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a 7-day baby step to rock life and retirement. So in the next 7 days, while you are quarantined or staying in your home more than ever before, maybe take a moment, go pull out, well, first locate and pull out your estate planning documents and just check the box of what you have and just peruse them. You don't have to read every word, but just look for who the executor is in your will, who are the beneficiaries of your IRAs, who are appointed as power of attorney for you, and just have them and refresh your recollection of what you chose. So that's your action item for the next 7 days. Well, I'm happy to report that Nicole and her family are doing very well. I just got back from a week and a half vacation of sorts where we were able to just relax, and I turned off a little bit. So I'm getting back into my groove. And generally, everyone in our family and Nicole's family are doing well, given this crazy 2020. One of my strategies has been that I try not to focus on the macro too much, meaning the macro news about elections or the civil unrest or what's happening with policing or COVID. The macro, too much information on the macro can, well, quite literally paralyze you and demoralize you, at least for me. And obviously the news cycle and the way the news is reported, or the opinion or whatever we want to call it is reported, exacerbates everything. And we forget that there's an overlay of an election, major elections coming up in November, which even absent all the craziness of 2020, we tend to see all of this stuff ramp up, even without all this extraordinary stuff. So the macro can be very counterproductive to your health. So what I've tried to do and building habits to do is focus on the micro. I know what I can do in a given day. I know how I can hopefully serve you on this podcast on a micro level, or working with a client, or loving on people in the RRC. What can we do next? Because it always has to come back to that. So I think it's a very good time to focus on the micro, focus on your household, and compartmentalize the world, because that's going to help you retain agency and make the most of this only life you have. So that's my strategy, and I hope it works for you, and look forward to chatting with you next week. Be well, okay? Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.